These ants have it all wrong. Instead of making a bee line to the enemy, they need to use some strategy here. I mean, you take that big bug right there. They could have spied her from the bushes and launched a surprise attack. That way you can attack these things in sections. After all, bugs are too disgusting for direct confrontation. I mean, one time these really smelly bugs ambushed me, and at the mere scent, I peed myself. Alright, so that last one might have been a stretch, but nonetheless, this is Ant Raid, a fun iPad game that, if you're a student, you might want to use caution when playing. I mean, it's so addictive, an entire term might go right down the shitter. Developed by Prank Ltd., Ant Raid is an iPad game very much worthy of such a spectacular pun run. It's gotten rave reviews since releasing to the App Store last summer, and it's since made its way to the iPhone as well, but I find that when squashing lesser life forms, a larger screen is far more conducive to the slaying. Now, as someone who primarily covers Nintendo on the console side of things, Pikmin immediately came to mind when I saw Ant Raid, and in a sense, the two games are actually quite similar. They're both real-time strategy games in which you control an army of very small life forms in a world that has some fun with size and perspective. So the similarities are obvious, but on the other hand, that's where they stop, because otherwise, Ant Raid is a unique game all its own. What's interesting about Ant Raid is that it takes a very simple approach to the RTS genre. Instead of focusing on management, the name of the game here is action. You're given a number of enemies, and it's your job to simply survive, to outlast the other insects by squashing them. And as you might expect, you do that by tapping. The game is played by touching the screen to select some of your ants, and then tapping an enemy to send them to attack. You can send just a few, or you can hold down on the screen to select more ants for a larger attack. And aside from some occasional frustrations, the touch controls actually feel pretty good. Once your ants crush the enemy, they automatically return to the base. Or at least the survivors do, and that's where you have to be careful in Ant Raid. Some enemies knock your soldiers out, and they remain stranded and wounded unless you send some ants to bring them back and heal them. And since you need all of your ants to complete these levels, you have to carefully consider when to go on those rescue missions, because they leave your team with lesser available soldiers. So the idea and core gameplay are both pretty simple, but Ant Raid does have some depth. Enemies come in 3 colors, each with a different ability. Killing enemies of the same color fills a meter, and once it's full, your army has those abilities for a limited time. The strategy is in figuring out when to use those abilities and how to make them last. Although, otherwise, there really isn't a whole lot of strategy in Ant Raid. That's even more evident when you consider that the game doesn't let you manage your units or, do some of the other things you might expect from an RTS. In fact, Ant Raid is more an action game with strategy thrown in, but what it lacks in those areas, it does make up for with addictive gameplay and sheer content. I mean, there are more than 100 levels, several different modes, and lots of challenging objectives. It may not be a very strategic strategy game, but whatever you call it, Ant Raid is a fun iPad game with plenty of charm, surprising challenge, and lots of bugs to squash. Oh, that's disgusting. These ants have it all wrong. Instead of making a B line to the enemy,